Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. For today's card, I used a stamp set from Mama Elephant called Little Agenda Trains, and then I also used this stamp set from Simon Says Stamp called Birthday Numbers. I picked out a bunch of different stamps from both of the sets and I put them in my Misti Tool, and I'm stamping them with Gina K Amalgam ink onto some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock. Now, because I planned on making quite a long train, I did have to stamp some of those images a few times so that I have enough. I'm going to be doing all of the coloring with my Copic markers, and the coloring did take quite a while because there are a lot of images here, so I did have to speed it up quite a bit. Before I actually stamped out any of these images, I did quite a bit of planning. I had the basic concept for the card in my head. I knew that I wanted to do a long train, and I knew I wanted it to be a birthday card for my nephew who's turning 2. So the first step of my planning process was to take a piece of cheap printer paper and stamp out my images and figure out the layout that I was going to use. And I just stamped those images directly on the paper using acrylic blocks, and it didn't really matter if I made any mistakes because it was just a planning page. It's kind of like sketching out a design, only a little bit clearer. My normal planning process for cards is usually to sketch out in a sketchbook, but when I have a really complicated card or a card with a lot of images like this one, sometimes I like to take this extra planning step. So once I figured out a layout that I wanted to use for the train, my next step was to pick out the colors. When I first envisioned the card, I had a very basic idea of the colors that I wanted to use. I knew that I liked the idea of blue and green and orange, but when I was planning out the card, I knew that I wanted a few more colors than that. Because of the number of images I have and the amount of detail that are in some of them, like especially with the presents and the cake and the balloons, I knew that I wanted more than 3 colors. So my next step was to think about what colors I could put with those 3 colors and it would still look good and it would still look like a little boy's card for a 2-year-old boy. Now, a lot of times when I'm struggling with coming up with my color palette, I will turn to Pinterest and I'll just look up color palettes on there. Like with this card, something I'd search would maybe be little boy's color palette or color palette for a little boy's party or something like that. And a lot of really good ideas will usually pop up on there. But for this card, because I had already picked out a couple colors that I knew that I wanted, the way that I figured out the rest of the color palette was by taking those colors in my Copic markers and swatching them on a piece of paper, and then kind of taking my other Copics and finding colors that I thought would go well with them. So I had those first 3 colors swatched out on a piece of scrap paper, and my next thought was to think about the rainbow and what colors would naturally go with those 3 colors. So my first color that I added was the yellow. Yellow is the natural color choice to go in between the orange and the green colors that I already had. So I picked out some yellow Copic markers and I swatched them out with my other swatches, and I really liked the look of them all together, so I added yellow to the color palette. After that, I knew I wanted to add one more color to my color palette, but when looking at the rainbow, I knew that I didn't want to add anything from the red family or the purple family. So instead, I decided to look at the color families that were already in my palette and mix 2 of them together for my final color. So after all of that process, I decided on a color palette of orange, yellow, green, blue-green, and blue. So I picked out all of the different colors of Copic markers that I was going to use for my color palette, and I swatched them all out, and I was ready to move on to the next step. So next I took the piece of printer paper that I had used to figure out my layout, and I actually colored in the train that I stamped on that with my Copic markers, but I didn't color it very well. I just colored it very quickly, and it was very messy, and it was just to figure out exactly where I was going to put all of the colors in order to make them flow and look nice together. Now at this point, you might be thinking that I put way too much thought and effort and time into just the planning process of this card. So I just want to clarify that I don't always put this much time and effort into just the planning part of my cards. The only reason I did with this particular card is because I was having kind of a hard time figuring the card out in the normal way that I figure cards out. So I needed to go a step further in order to get it all laid out and figure it out the way that I wanted to do it so that I could get it done and I could do it well. Sometimes if you're struggling with a card design and a concept, it's easier to really plan it out and know exactly what you're going to be doing when you start. And one of the really great things about this planning process is when I did start the actual card, I knew exactly which stamps I had to stamp and how many times I had to stamp them. And when I started coloring, I knew exactly where all of the colors needed to go. So it made the process much quicker than it would have been if I didn't do that process. Anyways, maybe I should talk a little bit about the actual coloring of these images now that that coloring is nearly done. So for each of the color areas, I used 2 different Copic markers and I blended them together. A lot of times I'll use 3, a light, a medium, and a dark, but for these images, I decided to use just 2 and blend them together. In the areas that have that really dark blue color, those areas were a little bit more difficult to blend together. And that's just because the 2 Copic markers that I was using there were a little bit too far apart in shade in order to get an easy blend. So the way that I get those 2 colors to blend together a little bit easier is by taking the lighter marker and touching the tip to the tip of the darker marker. And then I blend with that lighter marker and it works a little bit easier. I wouldn't have to do that if I owned a Copic marker that was closer in color to that darker blue that I wanted. But because I don't own that many Copic markers, sometimes I have to do little tricks like this in order to make my coloring work. With the wheels on my train, I used some gray Copic markers, and in order to create the illusion of motion on the wheels, I only shaded the upper left-hand side and the lower right-hand side of each of the wheels. I also made sure to follow the curve of the wheel while I was doing my coloring. To finish up all the coloring, I added a little bit of color to the top of each of those train cars, and then I cut those images all out using my scan and cut. Next, I took the Planks background stamp and I stamped it on a piece of Bazzill Licorice Twist cardstock with some Versamark ink, and then I embossed it with clear embossing powder. Now that piece of Bazzill Licorice Twist is cut to be 3.5 by 8.5, and I did prep it with my powder tool really well before I started stamping. Now that background stamp was not large enough to cover the entire panel, so in order to fill up the panel I did have to stamp it again on the other side, and I just did the same exact thing, stamping it with Versamark and then embossing it with clear. I added some foam tape to the back of the panel and popped it up onto a 9x4 card base. Each of the cars on my train is going to be holding some sort of item, so in order to connect those 2 pieces together, I used my Gina Connect glue and I added it to the back of the car piece, and then I took the item that's going to be inside the car and I placed it on that glue, and in order to hold it until it's dry, I used my tweezers and I set it aside and let it dry. Once I had all of those connected, I added some foam tape to the back of all of my images, and then I started placing them on my card. When I first placed each of these images, I made sure to place them very gently so that I could still move them around. Once I was happy with the placement of all of them, I pressed down so that they would be completely adhered. Next, I took the number 2 that I had stamped and colored, and I placed it so that it would be sitting in 2 of those little cars. I didn't show this before, but I did stamp out a bunch of the little cloud images that are in that little agenda train set, and I just stamped them with black ink onto some Neenah cardstock, and then I cut them out with my scan and cut and popped them up so that they look like they're coming from the train. For the sentiment on my card, I actually picked out a stamp from the Beautiful Flowers stamp set from Simon Says Stamp, and I stamped that with Versamark ink onto some Bazzill Licorice Twist cardstock, and then I embossed it with Alabaster white embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. I cut the sentiment down into a strip and I mounted it on a piece of vellum, and then I popped it up onto my card using some foam tape. I took a light gray Copic marker and I added some shading to the clouds. I also went over my sentiment using my Wink of Stella glitter brush. Using a white gel pen, I added some highlights to all of the images. I decided to take my Glossy Accents and go over just the face of the number 2. Because this card is for a little boy, I wanted to go a little bit crazier with the embellishments to make it a little bit more fun. To finish up this card, I first went over each one of those clouds using my Wink of Stella glitter brush, and then I added a sprinkling of these star-shaped sequins, and I glued those down using my Gina K Connect glue. Finally, I took my white gel pen and I added a few dots in between each of the cars of the train to act as connectors. And here's a closer look at the finished card, and you can really see all of those embellishments that I put on this card. I think it's a really fun card for a little boy or even a little girl. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you really enjoyed this little kid's birthday card design. All of the products that I used for today's card can be found in the description down below. If this is your first time on my channel and you enjoyed watching today, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that you can see all of my future videos. I'm going to be back with a new card design real soon. Again, thank you for watching. I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a good day today.